Hello everyone and welcome to week 3. In today's microlecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about drafting the remembered event essay and just some general tips and tricks that might help you really get started. Most of you did a really wonderful job who did the pre-writing discussion board prompt for week 2, in which I asked you to think about what your subject might look like, some of the purposes that you might want to have in writing this essay, and then who you envision your audience as you're writing this essay. I know you're turning it in for me to look at and for your peers to look at ultimately through a rough draft peer review and response, but also think about as you're writing it, who is your target audience? Who's the person you'd want to keep in mind? So, some things to think about. What should you do with your pre-writing? Now that you've done that from the discussion board, and if you haven't, I definitely would make sure that you have done some pre-writing. And your Nexus book gives several strategies that you can use, including clustering and listing and free writing. But what do you do next? And I think that's a really good question. The second question I want to kind of pose that I think we'll definitely answer by the time this is done is, how do you go from a few or even just one idea to completing a rough draft of at least 3 full pages, double-spaced typewritten, and in MLA format? And just so everyone knows, your LB brief has some really good tips and tricks just for what that MLA format looks like. You won't have to do any research necessarily per se in terms of consulting other people's sources and opinions and data, but you will need to do research in the sense of thinking through your own life experiences, looking at memorabilia, if you have ticket stubs or photos, or maybe there's a special item, or even potentially talking to other people who have gone through this event with you. That's going to be really important for you to consult as you're writing the remembered event essay, which is really a personal essay that is having you explore and really analyze an event in your life and why it was meaningful. You're creating a narrative. So a lot of the readings that you're doing this week, so there's a whole chapter dedicated to narration, are going to be really helpful for when you're writing this rough draft, which is due at the end of the week on September 29th. So let's talk about a couple ways that you can approach this writing process, how you can take your pre-writing materials and take it to the next level. One thing that I'm really going to advocate that all of you do is that you create a really brief outline to help you organize your thoughts. And I'm going to show an example of that. And I'm actually going to think aloud, which means I'm going to unpack my thinking as I'm writing this. So you really get a sense of what I'm talking about here. So here's an example. And I entitled the slide, "So What?" because I really think it's good for us to first start with those things that I asked during the week 2 discussion board. What's your subject? What's your purpose? Who's your audience? So my subject/general idea that I talked about in the discussion board, and I'm going to use as an example here, is when I hiked 17 miles of the Appalachian Trail with some of my friends, and I was woefully unprepared and I would probably argue underprepared. And my purpose for why I want to write it in terms of this particular essay is I want to entertain readers. I like to write things that are humorous. And I also want to reflect on what it was like doing an activity that I wasn't particularly good at. And so I've done little through hikes before, but never anything that was that long or that treacherous. And so definitely not necessarily ready for that level or skill of trail. And I think that's good to kind of reflect on in general. And for me, my audience, I really am writing this essay to reflect on my early 20s. I'm now in my mid-30s, and so it's kind of fun to remember and to preserve those memories. And then to also later down the road, perhaps share this essay with friends and other readers, especially those that might be interested in funny pieces that deal with adventure. So here's a sample outline that I created. And this is something that I would really encourage all of you to do before you start writing. It'll help you, and it'll also make you feel that you have somewhat of a security blanket. So you're not just staring at a blank screen going, think, think, think. You'll actually have a plan of action. And what I would probably do if this were my essay, and one of the things I definitely would advise you to do as well, is I would brainstorm kind of the general premise of what I want each paragraph to cover. So I start with number 1, my introduction. I go all the way down to number 9, which is the reflection, and in other words, the conclusion. And each of these topics And I think the way that I have them set up, they're pretty organized, but they didn't start out this way. So that's something to keep in mind too. But each of these topics could be a paragraph. I could write a paragraph about each of these things. And notice that in my sample outline, the goal isn't to write a whole bunch. This is a very brief outline. I don't even have examples underneath each of these ideas right now. This is just a really rough outline. And so I say, okay, first I'm going to introduce the essay with some action, and I'm going to start in the middle of the action with me furtively drinking this unfiltered creek water where I could have gotten giardia and all manner of things because I didn't pack enough water and I didn't have a water filtration system with me when I'm hiking kind of in rural Virginia. So you kind of get a sense of how desperate I am in this essay, but you also kind of hopefully want to read on because I've hopefully described my surroundings, how I'm guzzling creek water that's maybe not so wonderful and clean, and really it's starting to kind of catch the scene of, okay, what's going on here? What's the conflict? And then in my second paragraph, I'll flash back to how I got involved in this hike. So I'll introduce my friends, the main characters. I'll make sure I provide details and characterize who they are and how they're a part of the story. And I'll really make sure that I establish the context of how I got involved in this hike. Then in my third paragraph, I think it would be helpful for the reader to understand how I prepared for the hike. And I think one of the ways that I can heighten humor is to maybe compare how myself, then at the time a very inexperienced hiker, prepared for the hike versus how maybe, my friends who were much more experienced would have prepared. And I think that's one thing to kind of set the stage, doing some foreshadowing that something's not quite right. In that fourth paragraph, I think you can talk about, and I think this is what I would talk about if I were writing this essay. I talk about starting the hike, like what it was like on the ride up there, being really excited, feeling this sense of exuberation and exhilaration, and maybe even sharing my supplies if I haven't shared that already in paragraph 3. And then in the fifth paragraph, we're going to start to get into the action. So during the hike, I'm starting to feel really exhausted. I have this heavy pack on my back. I have a whole bunch of materials I don't need, such as an 8mm camera I don't want or need, various weird things that I didn't need to pack, and not enough water. And also I put mysticism because on this great adventure of the hike, one of the things that's really funny about when you're hiking is that, especially on these longer trails like the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail, you'll meet these people who aren't just they're through hikers. They're going to hike the whole 1,300 miles, for instance. And so we met kind of some weird characters. So we might briefly talk about that. Then in my sixth paragraph, I think I would really have that climax at that sleepless night. And I remember that night like it was yesterday, even though it's been almost 15 years. I remember hearing what I thought were bears, and then I heard like drag racing out in the distance, and the ground was tough, and I didn't have a good pad on my, for my tent or my gear, and just kind of what it was like to be awake at night, exhausted, thirsty, not happy, trying to figure out how the heck am I going to get out of this place. And then the tail end of the hike, this is like where I'm really motivated to get the hell out of this trail. And so I might talk about the fight or flight mode, and I am completely on flight. I am completely ready to leave the trail, not to be on the trail anymore. We get the story behind my trail name, which is kind of embarrassing and funny. And then as we're exiting the trail, we encounter these hikers who are wounded. And these are people who are really physically fit, and they're hurt. And so it kind of gives me pause at this point in the narrative to really reflect on the fact that it could have ended up a lot worse than just drinking muddy water. I could have been like bodily harmed. And then in the last two paragraphs, you're going to start to see more of this reflection. So less of the showing, and now we're delving into the telling. So I'd want to capture what it was like when I finally saw my friend's minivan that we'd traveled up to, and just the thrill of sitting down and taking my pack off my back. And then at the very end of this hike, all of my friends and I, we all went out to get a cheeseburger and French fries. And I totally felt no guilt, no shame. I was so happy to just eat something that was delicious and had 1,000,000 calories because I had just burned like 1,000,000 calories, then some. And then in my final conclusion, a quick tip, don't start your conclusions with in conclusion. That doesn't really work, and it's kind of over the top and not helpful. But I really want to start reflecting on why this experience? What does it mean to me? What are the lessons I've learned? What's the autobiographical significance? And so you might be used to having written essays before in the past where you start off with a thesis statement and then do that in the very beginning, like the first or second paragraph. But really, by the end of this personal narrative for the remembered event, your conclusion will probably contain that either very explicit thesis statement, e.g., your autobiographical significance, why this matters in the scope of your life and why you're choosing to write about it in the end. So that is how I would organize a sample outline. And that way I would have this next to me while I'm writing. You could either print it out or have it up as a document. And as I'm writing and getting things down in terms of my ideas, if I get stuck, jump to another paragraph and start writing that one. And then when you're done with that paragraph, go to the next one. And that way you at least have a clear focus of where you're headed and what's happening. So I would really, really encourage everyone to create an outline this week to get you started on this draft, because it's going to be really helpful. And as you can see, I have plenty for 3 pages. In fact, if I were to write this right now, I probably would have closer to 5 pages. So you really want to aim for having more. It's so much easier to cut than it is to create, so keep that in mind. And then I want to talk briefly about pie. And by pie, I don't mean this delicious, lovely pie here, though this is quite nice. These are actually pictures of the pie from my wedding when I got married over a year ago. We thought pie was way better than wedding cake, so we went with pie. But by pie, I'm talking about making a point, illustrating that point, and then explaining the point. And you might be scratching your head and saying, well, Professor Thornton, what the heck does pie have to do with writing? My point is you can write an essay paragraph by paragraph. So if you have your outline, your trusty outline next to you, and you start thinking about paragraphs in terms of what's the point of the paragraph, how do I illustrate that point within the paragraph, and then how do I explain that point in the paragraph, it will make your writing process so much easier. So let's look at an example. So the point, like we talked about, is the topic sentence most usually. Probably many of you have heard about topic sentences or main ideas of paragraphs. The illustration are the specific details and memories in terms of this remembered event essay. So what kinds of concrete or sensory details are you going to include? How are you going to characterize the people in your story? And how are you going to really move beyond tired phrases like good or bad? Those words don't really mean a whole lot, so how are you going to really use concrete, specific details to paint a picture? And then for your explanation, within that paragraph, your brief analysis or reflection of that event. So I want to give an example of what this might look like in action. So here's one example. I'm going to start with the point. Despite a good friend's warnings that I may not be prepared for the athleticism of my friends Tia, Julie, and Ross, I'm hell-bent to prove them wrong by hiking 17 miles of the Appalachian Trail this weekend. So that could be a really good topic sentence. It's clear what it's about. It's about hiking a trail. It's about that maybe the person in question, myself, is not ready to hike this trail. And it really starts the tone for what this paragraph's going to look like. And then for my illustration, this is just one example. Typically, many paragraphs are going to have 2 to 3 examples. So I gave the example of required camping gear includes an incredibly heavy 8mm camera to capture our backwoods adventure on film. And keep in mind, this is in the early 2000s. So this is actually 2000, so almost 14 years ago, which makes me feel old. But one of the things to keep in mind is you see that the protagonist in this particular essay, your teacher, is packing things that she would not need for a hiking trip. And so you're starting to see how ill-prepared this person is. And then explanation, there comes a point in every person's life when they question the gap between what the mind wills and what the body will allow. And this is, again, just one example sentence. You'd probably want to write more than this because typically, 3 sentences, which is the example here, is not going to make a paragraph. You typically want at least 5 to 7 sentences, if not more, to make that discrete paragraph. But see, you start to get the sense of, oh, okay, now I see how I'm building this. I'm going to build this essay paragraph by paragraph. Each paragraph is going to have a clear point. It's going to have some illustrations to talk about that point. And then it's going to explain why this matters, that so what piece. You really want to ask yourself, as you're writing, why does this matter? Why Why do we think this is important to share with the reader especially? So closing thoughts, things that I think will make you really successful this week if you start now. And by now, I mean Tuesday, get to cracking, start getting this done, because since it's due on Sunday, if you can get it done before that, just think how much nicer it's going to be. And you have a lot of other things to do this week. This is a busier week in our class. So really think through about how you can get Essay 1 started by outlining it, just doing a really quick and dirty sketch outline like I gave the example of. Second, get ready after you have that outline to write what I call a discovery draft. And really a discovery draft it sounds exactly like what it sounds like. You're writing to discover what it is you're trying to say. And you're not concerned yet with paragraph structure just yet. You can do that after you get the discovery draft done. You're not worried about identifying a thesis just yet, that autobiographical significance. And you're not yet worried about having perfect spelling or grammar. Those things, if you're overly focused on them when you first start writing, will really and truly stall you out. You won't actually get done. So just get a draft done. Just get something out there. It's much better to have a rough draft done that's very rough than no draft at all. And keep in mind, you're getting 25 points for turning in this rough draft on Sunday. So it's really important that you have that. Next, after you write this discovery draft, I want you to review and revisit it. And this is probably going to be, as Anne Lamott, the writer, says, a shitty first draft. I almost guarantee it. But what's great about shitty first drafts is they help you turn in terrific third drafts. So just make sure that you get a draft done, review it, and then look back at the assignment sheet. Go back and see, does my essay meet the assignment's purpose? And there are really strict criteria for selecting your topic. Your topic should be something that happens within a couple hours to no more than 1 to 2 days. So if you're telling some saga that goes over weeks or months or even years, you have not picked a topic that meets the criteria. So really make sure that you're following the assignment's guidelines. And if you have questions, please do not hesitate to ask. And then lastly, make sure you turn your rough draft in to the Week 3 digital Dropbox. So it's in that Week 3 folder under Weekly Modules. Make sure you turn that draft in. You're going to upload it as a Microsoft Word document or rich text format by Sunday, 9/29 before midnight Central Standard Time. And that leads me to my last little closing shot of some radically cherry pie. Happy writing. I know that sometimes it's tough, but really the rough draft should be one of your most fun stages. You're just getting ideas down. It's really generative and creative. So go wild, get it done. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Thanks everybody. Good luck during week 3.